Establish our motivation for being together for the next couple hours. As we've been talking about in the previous classes, right? We remind ourselves that we're not here meditating and contemplating together. Right? Obviously, we're not here for like some kind of status. Not here because of what somebody else will think about us. Not here for any kind of gain. But instead that we're here doing this together with a motivation of compassion. Some kind of recognition that we ourselves and all others are alike in wanting to be happy and alike in suffering. So we're here, right, to achieve a little bit more understanding, peace, wisdom, in order to be more effective in alleviating our own and others' suffering. So our motivation is compassion for ourselves, compassion for others. And ultimately, since our well-being and others' well-being are interdependent, are inextricably linked, then it's logical actually to assert that our motivation for being here is universal compassion for all beings. Wishing that all beings may be happy and all beings may be free from suffering. Taking a sense of responsibility to bring that about. And finally, kind of asserting bodhicitta motivation. Meditating, contemplating, to achieve enlightenment for the welfare of all beings. So with that motivation in mind, we'll continue on. So maybe we'll come out of the meditative mode just for a moment, stretch if you want, and make sure you're comfortable. Maybe I'll check just if anybody needs to move seats. So first of all, any questions from last class before we go on? If you want to come on. Maybe before we go on to like new topics, maybe we'll do it. Maybe we can do another brief meditation like last time. This time without the actual donut. I didn't bring an exhibit this time. But essentially, so let's do a contemplative meditation like that. Right? And so I want to remind you, because actually I think I've said this before. I think people like first of all, I said last time, right, that as the Holiness the Dalai Lama points out, the vast majority of the practices on the path are contemplative meditations, right? That breathing meditation we did is a kind of, I mean, that's part of the practice, right? But most of the practices are actually contemplations. And we started talking a little bit last time, right, that contemplative meditation is not an intellectualized exercise. It should be a visceral experience, right? If it's not experiential and sort of visceral, then it's not very effective, right, or meaningful. And also, like that. I also say one other thing about contemplative meditation, that we're all doing contemplative non-meditation all the time. actually. Meditation means cultivating a virtuous state of mind, actually. Actually, in Tibetan, gom is the word for meditation, so it means familiarizing yourself with a positive state, like so awareness or wisdom or compassion. What we're all doing all the time, contemplating something and giving rise to something. Oftentimes we're contemplating. Actually, if you really practice mindfulness in daily life as you're going around, what you'll find is that this is why the Buddha called our realm the desire realm. That's what he called this entire realm of existence, I guess we'll call it. And he said that he called it that because when people are walking around or laying around or driving around, whatever they're doing, that most of what they're doing is actually cultivating desire. So in other words, they see a sensory object, or they think of a sensory object, they bring it to mind, right? And then they think, I'd be happy if I had that, I'm not happy that I don't have that, how great it would be if I could have that, and so on. They elaborate all these exaggerated qualities of the object of desire. And then from that, right, then they, as we were saying last time, then they see somebody who has more of that, they think, oh, I'm jealous, they feel jealous of that person. They see somebody who has less of that, and they think, oh, I'm better than that person. And then they feel like somebody's thwarting them from getting what they want, and they get angry at that person. But so all that is grounded in the psychology of craving desire, right? That's what we were talking about last time. So, so we contemplate all the time, right? And what Buddhism is Buddhist psychology is trying to teach us is how to contemplate in a more, aware and wise way rather than a self-destructive way. In a way that brings happiness, not suffering. That's all. So actually, let's just do a contemplative meditation like that, and then we're going to do other contemplative meditations today. But I think since last time we did one, it'd be good to repeat that because doing it once doesn't help enough. If you've meditated increasing your craving for a long time, then meditating on wisdom about that once isn't enough. Actually, the Dalai Lama points out, I'll just point this out though, about these contemplative meditations. It's actually an interesting point the Dalai Lama often says, is that you have to do them repeatedly, of course, but actually, from a Buddhist point of view, you've been doing the wrong ones since beginningless time, they say, right? So infinitely. But the Dalai Lama points out that you don't have to do the one that's wise and accurate. You don't have to do endlessly. And he said the reason why is that it's the truth. In other words, and that ultimately the truth outweighs a projection. Right? In other words, if you've had false ideas about something, right? In other words, just thinking that something more accurate once doesn't solve the whole problem. But because when you see something that's true and accurate, it has more power because it's grounded in reality. It doesn't take forever for you to change. Does that make sense? So the idea here is that you want to see things accurately and then hold your mind and familiarize yourself with that. That's the goal, the meditation. Right? But because if something is grounded in the truth, then that has its own power because it actually corresponds to reality. And so if you familiarize yourself with that for a while, both your attitudes, your feelings, your relationships, and your behavior all change. So that's the good news. It's that you don't have to do that. You don't have to so it takes some practice, but it doesn't take endless practice if your contemplation is in line with what's true.
Is there any advice you can give on how to arouse that visceral experience? Sometimes when I'm doing these meditations, it's hard to really get the feeling of it. Sometimes it just stays it's kind of in the realm of ideas, distant kind of thing. Is there any advice you could give?
Yeah, I'll say one thing. Actually, what we're going to get. Actually, the last subject today is going to be all about that. Actually, okay. So maybe we'll wait because actually we have 3 topics today. This is first one. We have 2 more. The last one's all that. Cool. So we'll get to that for sure. That's going to be. I like that topic actually. So that'll be the last one today. But okay. So for now, we'll just do a meditation like that. That's kind of the same one we did last time, but I'll guide us through it. Right. So. For this particular one right now, the first step is to think of one thing, and this is, for now I'm not going to get into detail of how to bring it up viscerally, but just do your best. But think of one thing that recently, in recent days or weeks or last few months, one thing that you've really had craving desire for, right? Like that, where it was very strong experience. And and that could be, so the object of your craving, again, you just want to think of one, but I'm going to give some examples, and then you pick a specific one to you, right? But it could be a certain kind of a food item, right, that you really were wanting. You know, it could be another person, right? Boyfriend or girlfriend or something. It could be a job, right? It could be like somebody's praise, right, that you desperately wanted and were feeling insecure and really wanted somebody to say you were wonderful or something like that. You know, it could be an item you wanted to buy, right, like whatever, you know, some electronic item or car or clothing item, something like that. But so just think of one example of something where it was visceral, though, you know, where in other words, where it was a real feeling of really wanting. And then as you bring that experience to mind, right, so think of that object of desire, right? And then notice, first we're just going to notice, right, so how does it feel, right, like from your side, inside you, in your own body, when you think of wanting, of that object of desire and of wanting that, then how do you feel inside? So this is actually, again, we're trying to just cultivate the truth, we're not trying to make something up here. So you bring that object to mind, and how do you feel inside? What's the feeling in your chest, in your stomach? And then also notice how you feel about that object, right? And even like notice how the object appears to you. Right? If you visualize that object, right? If you think about that object, how does it appear to your mind? And now we're just going to contemplate from various angles our experience with that. So one part of that is to look at how does it feel, right, when you're looking at that object, you know, whether literally looking at it with your eyes or just thinking about it, in other words, that thing that you want, and you can't have it. Right? At the beginning, you don't have what you want. So if you check, actually, honestly, your own experience, right, it's actually an uncomfortable feeling of longing, right? There's some feeling in yourself like you're empty, right? Like the happiness is out there, and inside there's some feeling of emptiness, of not having, right, of like longing. That's a sense of dissatisfaction. Because for sure, right, when you're wanting something and don't have it, by definition, that's a kind of dissatisfaction of wanting. A feeling kind of incomplete. Right? And then there's the process of like seeking that, right, in one way or another. Which, depending on what the object is, right? You check for yourself, notice with your particular example. But if you check, it's not entirely comfortable, the seeking part, right? Because you don't yet have. And sometimes it's quite, you know, sometimes there are various kinds of difficulties in trying to get what you want. Also, there are always costs, right, of some kind or other. Whether it's money or time or energy. And often there's also the insecurity, right? Will you get what you want? And then when for various reasons you can't get what you want, right? So if you long for something, you make effort, you even maybe go through some expense or hardship, and then you fail to get it, whether it's because the other person, you know, it doesn't want to praise you, or the store is closed, or whatever. You can't afford the item. They ran out, whatever it is, right? Then for sure there's suffering. That's like quite a negative, painful experience. And then comes actually the subtler part, which is if you do get the item, if you do get the thing, the experience that you're craving, then you check with your own experience, but actually what happens is, right, that there's usually some kind of feeling of excitement, right? And then after that you start to notice gradually, right? First you don't notice it. Actually it begins before you're aware. But then gradually you start becoming aware that there's the suffering of having what you wanted. Whether that's like the fear of losing it, whether that's the fear of you know, like some kind of insecurity, let's call it that. Also, whether it's the negative feelings about the side effects of having that. So, like, you could be excited to have a new job, but then once you have the new job, of course, then there are hardships involved. You can want a new relationship, but then once you have the relationship, then there are problems. You can want some item, right? But then once you have that item, it starts aging. Right? And it eventually will break down. Also, you stop, like if you continue with whatever that contact with that item, at first there's some excitement, but inevitably, right, it starts to become less interesting over time. Like, or what's the word? The level of excitement decreases. And there's a process of wanting more, wanting something else. So go back now to that initial feeling, right, of longing, right, where there's a feeling of me, right, and then this object out there, oh, I want that, I'll be happy. As soon as I have that, then everything will be great. It's the feeling, right? And just analyze for yourself. This is your own wisdom checking up. Again, we're not saying the object is good or bad here. We're just looking at our own process, actually. Right? And so ask yourself, in my process, when I was longing for, when I am longing for, craving that object, am I exaggerating, actually? Or am I being realistic, or am I exaggerating the happiness that would come? Am I distorting and exaggerating the positive aspects of the experience or the object that I'm creating? Am I imagining that it's more feeling, even not just imagining, but actually like feeling and projecting that that the object is more perfect than it is? That it will bring some kind of lasting, true, pure happiness. Is the way I'm relating to that object, again, this is not to criticize or deal, this is not about the object, it's my own process, but is my way, my process in relation to that object causing me suffering? is it possible that the exact way I thought I was seeking happiness is actually bringing me suffering? Is my manner of seeking happiness, through that particular external experience or object, actually compounding my own suffering? Creating problems because I'm not, perhaps not seeking happiness in the wisest way, out of habit. So go back to that initial visceral experience of wanting, and from your own wisdom, check it. See if that way of being in the world is a cause of happiness or suffering. See if that way of being in relationship is realistic or distorted. And then whatever recognition you have that's based on your reasoning, your own analysis, your observation, whatever recognition you now have about that, then just for a few moments hold your mind in that valid recognition, in that accurate understanding. Like let your mind familiarize itself, or like rest in that understanding, in that insight, in that way of seeing. Okay, so then we'll come back into more interactive mode again. So any questions about that?
I think I really noticed, I was really getting the visceral and feeling the poured out feeling of longing. And I think I realized it's not the object that I'm attached to, it's that feeling, the longing, the suffering part that I'm really, really attached to. That's the part I like. Like, how do you fix that? If you see it suffering but you like it, how do you make it stop?
So I say this is like actually, so it's not so unusual that, because it's like, actually, like I said earlier, the Buddha called it this whole realm the desire realm, right? So in a way, like that feels like home, right? Like there is that's our normal state, is craving, actually, right? That was what the Buddha said, was people are always like, not always, but people spend most of their time, and not just people, actually, animals too, spend most of their time craving. So that's not unusual at all. In other words, that's like, you know, it's kind of like whatever we're familiar with feels like home to us, right? And like, you know, it's the same thing as like, let's point out like, so like that state of craving is so familiar, right? And I think what helps though, the first is we have to see it. In other words, usually we're so like, what's the way to say it? We're so in it that we don't even notice that we're doing it. It's just like our normal state of existence, of relationship. So the first thing is to notice it, right? Then the second thing is to watch it for a while, right? Because you have to, like, what's the way to say it? Like, in other words, we have to like actually observe ourselves and become convinced, actually. Because, well, actually, maybe I'll share this. We went through this once in one of the classes that we did. Like, what they say is that sometimes in Buddhism there's this thing about what's it called? Valid cognition, valid understanding, valid cognition is the technical term, really. And what they talk about is this, is like, that at first you're in a certain state. Like, let's say you feel, like, first a person would feel desire, like a craving is good, and I have no doubts about that, right? Like if you ask actually many people, right? If you go to the mall and if you walked around the mall and started interviewing people, most people would say craving is wonderful, right? Actually, it's bad for business if people stop craving, and you know, like our economy is based on that, right, and so on. And if you ask, like, you know, advertisers, they would say, please don't stop craving, right? Like, and if you ask businesses and so on, right? Like so actually, from a Buddhist point of view, that would be a wrong understanding. In other words, but Buddhism would, Buddhist psychology would say that's a cause of suffering, so that's a wrong view, right? But it's a wrong view that the person actually completely believes, and that's normal. So that's what you're describing, right? So when you see that, that's good. Because actually, what they say then is this: is there's a whole process psychologically a person goes through. So from wrong understanding, the next phase, the next progress is doubt that leans in the wrong direction. In other words, so you're saying, you start off like, I think, you know, craving is great. And then you say, but maybe it's not always great, right? So you're still feeling familiar with it. That's what you're describing, right? That moment where you feel like, this is what feels at home, I kind of like it, but maybe it's not the cause of happiness. So actually, that's the first step. That's the first step in developing wisdom, and for a Buddhist side. And then what they say is the next step is doubt and equal. You know, where you eventually you keep practicing, but you keep contemplating the faults and how it's happening. And then at a certain point, if you keep going, eventually you'll reach a point where you say, I don't know, I'm kind of, you know, I could go either way about this. It may cause me more suffering, it may cause me more happiness. I feel like it causes me more happiness, but when I meditate, it seems clear that it causes me more suffering. And you start to get to an even. And then eventually, if you keep going, you get to doubt leaning in the correct direction, right? Where that's still a habit, and you say, I really think it's probably causing me a lot of problems. You know, you start to feel that. It's not just a thought, but it's a feeling. And actually, I want to keep going a little further, because then there comes a point where you have correct supposition. That would be like where if you've heard a lot of teachings and studied a lot, and you've meditated a fair amount, where, you know, when you catch yourself craving, this is not just intellectual now, it's like when you catch yourself in that state of craving, you actually feel, I sort of think that's probably not helpful to me. You know, like that's the feeling that would come up. That's a lot of progress already. But that's not yet. Then you finally, after that, you get to a correct, valid cognition. That's where you finally reach the point where you say, you have a clear, decisive, visceral experience. Wow, like you're not yet perfect, you know, but you have a real experience where, like, when craving arises, you go, oh man, that's again causing me suffer. Like, I don't like that. You know what I mean? And it's like, and I want to point out something. This is not that mysterious. Actually, if you talk to anybody who's had an addiction, right? That's the process. And there somebody finally reaches a point where they have a valid cognition, and then that something happens, right? It's not like I thought about like a friend who had smoked his whole life, right? Who had heard, I mean, he had heard his whole life, for 50 years, he had heard how terrible smoking is, right? And then finally there came a point where the doctor said to him, don't even come back. You know, like, you're going to be dead. I don't want to see you again. Like, you know, if you're not going to quit smoking, I can't help you. Like, you're going to be dead, you know. And the person had this valid, something happened that was a valid, for them, that valid, where they was like, oh, I'm really going to be dead, you know, and they stopped smoking. You know, like, it's not that the craving went away completely, right? Before that, the feeling was, smoking makes me happy, right? But then there came a certain point in their progress, right, in their process, where they had that real experience of a valid cognition, where, and that helps them, right? It's not that the craving goes away, but then they immediately think, I don't want to die, right? Like, and that thought comes up very clearly, and then that's a more effective, you know, so if we have the first step, the doubt, like, that's like when, you know, that's like for that smoker, when their kid said, oh, you should really stop smoking, you know. Oh, yeah, they're probably right, but I'm not so sure, you know, like, I'm not really gonna, but yeah, they're probably right, but I'm certainly not gonna, because I believe it makes me happy, right? Actually, the belief is it makes me happy. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So actually, there's a whole process we have to go through. So the first step is that, though, is what you described. So we all should have that experience at some point. So, and about each contemplation, actually, we have to start off. Actually, we start off with the wrong view, and then we get to doubt, and so on. So does that kind of make sense?
Yes.
So that's actually a good sign. In other words, that's a sign of the beginning of wisdom. Doubt is the beginning of wisdom, they sometimes say. You know. Because actually, you have to. In other words, if you're going to become more wise, you have to start with doubting what you believe, right? And then you keep challenging it and challenging it and challenging it until you come to some decisive insight for yourself based on your own analysis. And that's why also there's a difference between, I just want to point that out, that's why there's a difference between what I call them, what was it, the correct valid cognition that has to come from your own personal insight. That's different from valid supposition. Valid supposition can come if, like, for example, if you really trust somebody and you've heard from them something, and you sort of say, oh, they're probably right, But that's not the same as when you really have realized it for yourself. Does that make sense? For your own experience. So the goal in Buddhism is that with any of these contemplations is to eventually come to one's own, decisive personal insight from experience and contemplation. But you have to, nobody gets there at the beginning. You have to go through a whole process.
So is that the inferential?
What's that?
Inferential, like, is it direct valid cognition? Is it the inferential?
That's still inferential, yeah. That can be inferential, and then there are other times where it becomes a direct perception. Yeah. So to differentiate those two, that's two different. That's another step. In some cases, there is no. Some things could just be inferential, but then there are some times where you actually reach like a direct cognition, a direct perception of something, and those are both valid cognitions, though. Whether it's an inferential valid cognition is still is considered totally valid, and so is a direct. So a direct perception can also be totally valid. Yeah, and those are both valid ways of knowing.
I'm just a little bit concerned because then I start saying, well, the world of craving is not helpful. But if I'm hungry and I'm craving Brussels sprouts, okay, I would think that would be, so some craving, is all craving bad, or is some craving, how do we distinguish, if there is distinguishing, if you know what I mean?
Yeah. So that was where, again, so we have to do that. If you look at the analysis we just did, the experiential thing we just did, then the way you do it actually is through your own introspection, right? Like, in other words, so because we're not this is just saying, like, what's how we say it? Like, there are certain cravings where if you analyze them honestly, it's clear, right? In other words, there's no doubt. If you look at it and really analyze, wow, my process with that is compulsive. There's a projection. There's an exaggeration. There's an expecting something that I can't get from the object because I've built up in my mind a kind of idea that it's going to be some kind of lasting happiness, but objects can't bring lasting happiness, and so on, right? And if you watch your own process with that and you really analyze it in the way we just did over and over, and you kind of watch yourself, right? Then in those cases it's clear, right? You can come to a clear understanding. Wow, that's causing me suffering, But then, we had mentioned, last time, a little bit about this, right? That there are other, desires, let's call them, right? Where if you analyze, you check for yourself, right? You analyze your process, and you can see, well, no, that one seems realistic. Like, in other words, so for example, if I say, well, like the Brussels sprout, right? If I say, well, I'm hungry, and if I don't eat anything, I'm going to be sick. And if I eat something healthy, I'll feel better. Well, that's actually not, there's not something unrealistic there, actually, right? Like, if you say, and again, like if a person says, well, I really want to, try to, whatever, eat.
So how do you feel if you want Brussels sprouts and you don't get it?
This is what we're getting at, right? So you have to check, actually, for yourself, right? Like, in other words, each person has to check for themselves their own process with that, right? So in other words, it's not that Brussels sprouts are the good object and candy's the bad object. It's not that, right? That's not what Buddhism's asserting anyway. What Buddhism's asserting is you have to check for yourself how are you relating to the Brussels sprouts, right? And that's what you're getting at. So if the person is recognizing, like on the one hand, like if somebody's saying, Brussels sprouts are here, I'm hungry, they're available, that's great. It's a healthy thing to do, and I'll feel good after I eat them. Well, good. That's not a problem. On the other hand, if you say, let's say you're saying, I'm in this place and there's no Brussels sprouts and I have to eat Brussels sprouts and what's wrong with these other people? Why don't they have Brussels sprouts? And then again you're creating a problem for yourself. So you have to check for yourself and your own experience, right? That's the key. Is am I am I being realistic to my situation and to my relationship or not? Right? And so there's not like a formula. This is part of what's hard about practicing, actually, is that it has to be realistic to the situation and to the context and to the relationship. And you have to, and what's the word? And it's easy to deceive yourself and to pretend, you know, or to make up a rule so that then you can say, but actually you can check, again, like you said, right? Also, that with wisdom also there should be a certain amount of flexibility, right? In other words, if you're not caught in a projection about something, right, then you have to, then it would imply a certain level of flexibility to the relationships. And then actually there's another way, so that actually is a good transition to the next topic anyway. Because there's another way of, not about Brussels sprouts particularly, but there's another way of checking with desires, actually, checking on your desires, and that was the next topic anyway,
Can
which
I
is...
ask one question?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Transition.
Yeah.
Does craving and aversion coexist?
From a Buddhist perspective, actually, from a Buddhist perspective, usually craving, how should we say it? So say this right. Actually, well, so from a Buddhist
So going
psychological
back to
perspective,
Brussels sprouts, you want it, you don't get it, you start despising that particular feeling.
yeah. So ordinarily, it's a sequential actually. Like in other words, the tricky thing is that sometimes they can go very fast back and forth. Some people can go, you know, within 1 second you can go back and forth actually, because the mind goes very fast. But technically, from Buddhist psychology, they would say that, like for example, so you ordinarily there's like a actually what they say really is this: is that you have contact with something, there's some experience in other words, and then there's always like a feeling tone of either pleasure, pain, or neutral feeling to any experience, and that then so then if there's a pleasure feeling, then the mind tends towards craving. If there's a displeasure or unpleasant one, it tends towards the aversion. And oftentimes what's there to say it? You know, and then of course it can be very complicated because not that complicated, but of course a lot of times craving, right, then leads to aversion, as you implied, because you know you're craving for this, but then you don't want that, and then also you're craving for this, but then you don't like the person who's getting in the way of that, and so oftentimes that's why in the basic, what I was saying about the desire realm, what the Buddha was pointing out really was that desire is almost continuous actually, but then it's sometimes interrupted by aversion or anger or jealousy or other states of mind, and then we often go back to craving again. So it's sort of like, for ordinary people, like craving is almost like their baseline, but then they get distracted from craving when they're enraged or when they're in other states of mind or something, and then they come back. Now, of course, there are moments where not craving either, you know, which is different, but that's so chronic. So yeah, so both exist, but usually like, it'll be like you know, craving, aversion, craving. That would be the typical pattern. On a bad day, though, the person could be quite averse, right, and angry, which is more agitated state of mind, actually, right? Anger is more agitated. Isn't it? But did that answer it?
Yeah.
Well, so the next contemplation I just wanted to at least bring up was something we had talked about a little bit last time, which is impermanence, right? And again, like I'll start with this, like actually the Buddha taught so much on impermanence, right? And it's in one way. Sometimes you could look at it and say, well, why teach so much on it? Because it's so obvious, right? In other words, of course, everything's impermanent, actually. But again, this is the reason why I say that is that for the real contemplations on this, if you're going to really contemplate impermanence, what it is again you have to look at yourself first, right? That we have an unrealistic view or feeling or belief, not intellectual but experientially actually, or emotionally, let's call it, that things are permanent, actually. That's the problem, right? So we don't understand experientially the impermanence of things, right? And what the Buddha is getting at is that therefore we create huge amounts of suffering because of that, right? So we feel I'm permanent, right? And therefore, that creates a lot of complexities in our relationship because it's not true, actually, right? Actually, there's nothing about us that lasts even in a second. The Buddha said there's nothing about you that lasts even for a second, right? And there was, even for a moment, actually nothing, right? Your mind is not the same from moment to moment, and your body, actually just from physics, you don't need to study, right? Like if you study biology, even the most basic biology, right? Actually, if you think about how, like, you know, this is what the Buddha's getting at. You know, if somebody comes up to you and like slaps you on the shoulder, right? Your feeling is I'm here, I'm permanent, right? I'm some kind of solid thing here, right? That's the feeling that arises viscerally, isn't it? You know, and also like if somebody is going to do something, like a doctor is going to do some procedure that that you're nervous about, right? The feeling is I'm here and I'm this permanent thing and something's going to harm me, right? I'm stable, and yet, you know, I mean, again, like biology says that's not true, right? Like in other words, actually, if you were to try to contemplate just the number of changes that are happening in 1 second in this, just in your body, right? Actually, you can't conceive of them, right? Like in other words, if you think of all the capillaries and arteries and veins, you know, and then of course all the cells, right? There's nothing stable in any of your cells, right? Like the cells are constantly going through processes, right? And then like your neurons are firing like, actually you can't even, you know, like conceive of how fast, right? Like you know, computers can't keep up, right? And even every neuron firing actually has so many processes. It's not just one process. You can say, oh, a neuron fired, right? Actually, there are so many like neurotransmitters, right? And for those neurotransmitters are between the cells, but also they're happening inside the cell, right? Something's happening in the cell that allows something to be released, which means that something's happening on the edge of one cell, but then also on the edge of another cell. You know, that's just one neuron, right, that fires. There are hundreds of processes that allow that one neuron to fire. But there are millions firing it, just as you're listening right now, right? And so you have this idea, oh, I'm some stable entity that's here, but actually it's not true, right? And if you think about it, right, your eardrum as you're listening, right, and then the light that's hitting it's so complicated what's happening inside your body, right? Like how many processes are happening, and then and then we didn't even get to that. Your heart's pumping, right? Otherwise, all the rest wouldn't be happening. And and then I mean, actually, you can't even imagine, right? Your liver, all the organs, right? Your spleen, all these different organs are performing functions at the same time. And so the idea here is, like, we took what's the word? You took a biology class like in what, high school, and probably one in elementary school too, right? But so we know these things, right? But the issue that the Buddha was getting at is that we don't apply them to our feeling, right? In other words, when somebody comes up and goes, hey, or when the doctor is going to do a procedure, or when, or just when we wake up in the morning, right? We feel, oh, how do I feel today, right? We're not aware. We're not relating to our body, for example, as something that's like a water bubble, right? And that's unbelievably impermanent and changing. And actually, water bubble is not even a good analogy. Like water bubbles are more stable, almost, than our body. Because a water bubble, it sort of abides and then pops or something, right? Our body's already changing so much, actually, in that amount of time. And then our mind, right? Actually, I don't know which changes faster, actually, right? Like, if you observe your mind, actually, if you observe how much is happening in your mind, right? That, like, you're aware of the colors, you're aware of the sound, you're aware of so many things, right? You also have, how many thoughts have you had since you came in here? Actually, you couldn't count them. Like, if you tried to keep track of every little one, it would be impossible, right? Because even the thought of what color is the carpet, right? You're vaguely aware of that subconsciously, right? What time is it? Who's sitting next to me? What color is the chair I'm on? Like all these, like there are thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of thoughts. Right? And yet we somehow have this feeling of as if we're something abiding. Does that make sense? And so the idea here again is like the one we just did about the craving. What the Buddha is getting at is not like, sometimes people think like, I don't know, people have different views, and sometimes people don't like thinking about impermanence or something, but actually what the Buddha was saying is just, is you have to be realistic about things, right? About your nature and the nature of objects. And of course, if we're impermanent, then others are impermanent too, right? Actually everything, right? What the Buddhist teaching, the technical teaching, they say is everything that's produced by causes and conditions changes from moment to moment. And actually, you can't. I mean, the more you've studied biology and physics, especially, right, then you can't debate that. Actually, there's every object that whether it's a wall or and yet when you look at these walls, do you think they're impermanent? Like when you walk in here and look at the walls, do you think, oh, these are impermanent? That's not the feeling that comes, right? And yet, you all walked in this building, right? Is this building brand new? Clearly not, right? It's not a new building at all, right? So, when did this building start aging? Like, did it start today? Aging? No, it's been aging all along. So you look and you say, so these walls, I assume, like the floor, right? I feel this floor is permanent. And yet it's been aging, like ever since it was first constructed. Right? As soon as it was labeled a floor, right? The moment it was labeled a floor, it started being aging, right? It was a 1-day-old floor, or a 2-day-old floor, now it's however many years old floor, right? And someday, right, the building won't be here, obviously. Right? So the point is like, that, do you see what I'm getting at there? We have this feeling, you look at your car and you feel it is permanent or it better be permanent, right? Because if it breaks down, that's gonna be really annoying. And yet, like, the reality is it's made up of parts that are changing every moment, right? And at any moment it won't, for sure, at some point it's gonna stop working, and it could happen at any moment, right? Same with your body, by the way, right? Sometimes it's gonna stop working, it's gonna stop functioning at some point, and actually you don't know when, right? So one thing about this impermanence part is it's the truth, right? In other words, you can't deny it. I mean, this is not, there are some things in Buddhism that are harder to understand. This one is not hard to understand, right? Like, in other words, you can't actually, no matter how hard you try, you can't debate it. But the first thing is you want to bring up the feeling, in other words, like the feeling this building's permanent, right? Actually, this is important with your house, right? Your place that you live. You know, you feel it's permanent, right? And then that's why, like, if something happens, like a flood, right? Like if something breaks, and you say, how can that happen? Like, what do you mean, how could that happen, right? Like, it was inevitable to happen. It's just, when would it happen? You know, like, you know, and same thing with your body, right? Like, you get sick and you think, why am I sick? How could this happen to me? Right? Like, what do you mean, how could it happen to you? You have a body. That's the nature of your body, right? There is, like, the way it could happen to you is you were born, right? Like, things like that. You know, and you know, or you have a relationship, right? And then the relationship seems good, and then it becomes trouble, right? And you say, why is this happening? Well, that's what happens in relationships, right? Because it's the nature of relationships, they change over time, you know? Or you have a friend, and then later the friend doesn't treat you nice, right? You say, why? They were my friend, how could they treat me that? You know, well, that's just the nature of relationships. In other words, they change over time, right? Everything changes over time. That person's changing, you're changing. So of course this is gonna happen, right? Like, so what the idea here, you know, this is, I guess, what I wanted to emphasize today about this, coming to it now, is that oftentimes, like, especially with, I don't know if this is true with, I don't know if it's true in other cultures, but for sure, oftentimes here, when you talk about impermanence and death, right, people say, oh, I don't want to think about it, actually, right? Like, that's usually the feeling comes up. Death, oh, come on, like, change the subject, please. You know, that's like people's reaction, actually, right? And actually, you see that also, like, I sometimes work, you know, I'm a psychologist, so I work with, like, people who are, you know, I see that, I'm surprised, like, that, you know, people, like, lose a loved one, and, you know, because other people feel they have to be polite, they ask once, are you okay? And if you're okay, I ask, no, I don't have to ever bring it up again. You know? That's like that's the attitude I sometimes see, and I'm like, wow, really? Like, they didn't ask a second time? No, like, you know, they made their thing that they could ask once, and because they don't want to think about it, right? So, like, you know, like, you go to the funeral, and they maybe ask once after that, if it's a close friend, and then they stop asking. Oftentimes, not all people, of course, but most, actually, which I was surprised by when I first realized that. But it's because people so dislike thinking about it, actually. And the point is this, the point I want to emphasize is this, is like, actually that's like, so I say it. I sometimes translate this idea of self-cherishing, sometimes translate, but I call it narcissism. It's the same thing, I think. But that narcissism, which we all have, Buddhism says, like wants to deny impermanence, actually. Whereas we want to say, I'm not impermanent. We want to hold on to an idea that I'm permanent, my stuff is permanent, anything I own is permanent. Other stuff, like we could say, things in other parts of the world can be impermanent, but my stuff needs to be permanent. That's actually the feeling of narcissism. It doesn't care about others, but it cares about one's own, you know, like my neighborhood, my friends, my body, you know, so it's wrong. It's actually a totally wrong understanding, but that's the attitude with that self-cherishing, narcissistic attitude. And the idea here is this, first of all, that creates a lot of suffering, actually. And so this is the reason, it's not just that it's unrealistic, which it is, obviously, right? But it also creates suffering for us, because, like I said earlier, right, first of all, I was giving those examples, right? Then things change and we get angry and upset, actually, right? Rather than recognize, of course they're going to change. And I remember being very struck by this when, like, in other words, I'll just share, you know, just a personal insight about it. Like, you know, when you talk, like, oftentimes I thought about this, like, I have many, you know, good friends who are Tibetans, because just in Buddhism, and oftentimes I thought, wow, early on I thought, how could they be that way? That, like, when many of them I knew, when they tell me the story, right, when the Red Army invaded and they were bombed and shot at and then had to leave behind everything, and most of them who escaped had nothing, right? They left with absolutely no belongings except the clothes on their back, right? Had to walk over the Himalayas, and and oftentimes I would think, wow, that sounds so traumatic, it sounds horrible, and for some it was, but for many it wasn't, actually. And I thought, how could that be that they weren't traumatized or don't feel not just not angry, but also not even like resentful or something? Now some are, but many were not. Who I talked to. And then I realized it was because they had understood impermanence. In other words, it wasn't like a big shock. These things happen in the universe, right? Like, actually, all of human history is that, right? The only reason that people aren't that the only reason people aren't that all humans aren't still in Central Africa is that, right? Is that people had to move, right? There was Holocaust, horrible things happened, and people moved. Why would somebody leave there and walk to the Middle East, and then to why would somebody go all the way to Australia? Right? In other words, people don't go to Australia. The first humans didn't travel to Australia or didn't walk across ice bridges because they thought it was fun, right? In other words, it's the whole human history was that, actually, right? Like, why are people in China? Why are people in Europe? The whole history of human beings was that horrible things happened and people had to flee, right? Or there were famines and people had to flee. That's the whole, so if you actually analyze why is the whole Earth populated with humans, it's, again, it wasn't that people were in, wasn't that people were in the Middle East, for example, and then said, wow, it'd be really fun to walk, to Europe, where it's freezing cold. I really want to go to freezing cold, like North Europe, right? Whereas they went because there wasn't enough food, right? Like, it's obvious, right? Same reason people came, same reason why did people come to the United States, right? Most of our ancestors came here, right? They came because things weren't good where they were, right? If you were really comfortable where you weren't going to go on a boat that was, especially back, it was a while ago, right? It was like, could sink, and it was like rats. And so actually the whole human history is like that, right? But we don't think that way, And so then we were like shocked when we're shocked even if our friend who liked us before now doesn't like us, right? Like it shows a certain immaturity also, and it causes a lot of suffering. And so the idea here is this, that if we actually think about impermanence, it gives us some peace of mind, actually. It allows us to be a little more relaxed, actually, and a little more, what's the right way to say it? Both realistic, but also like mellow, or something like that. And also to focus on the right things. So actually I was going to just quote, I'm not going to read the whole poem, but there's a poem by a long poem about impermanence by the 7th Dalai Lama. So I'm just going to start with one line of it here. He says, look and ask among the people of your land for anyone even 100 years old. You will be lucky to find even one. Do you not think your own death certain? And so I just want to start with that because, again, this is not one that you have to be, it's not culture specific, right? It's true, right? And there was, if you add 120 years to that, then there's nobody, right? Does anybody know anyone over 120? It's not, they're not around, right? And the point there, though, that the Dalai Lama, I think, is getting at, the 7th Dalai Lama, is this, think about the things that upset you, right? Or this is part of what this is getting at. Think about the things that you get upset about, right? A financial problem, or a relationship problem, or a problem at work, right? And then step back for a moment and think like that, right? Actually, the people who are like the person at work who's giving you a hard time, and you and your coworkers, 100 years from now will all be, actually not only will you be dead, but nobody will remember you, right? And the place where you worked won't still exist, most likely. Or it may have moved, it's just the truth, right? You think about that with wars, right? Like, think about the people who were fighting, in the, the two soldiers on either side in the Revolutionary War, right? There's no one remembers their names. We remember George Washington, a few others, right? But actually, they're all dead, right? In other words, the winner died and the loser died, right? Shanti Davis said that, right? He points it out. He says, actually, the people on both sides are soon to be corpses one way or another. If you survive the war, you're going to be a corpse, and if you don't survive the war, you're going to be a corpse. And also, if you don't go to war, you're going to be a corpse, right? The point is, the things that seem like such big dramas to us, when seen in that perspective, seem a little less upsetting, right? Like, you can almost say like, what am I getting that worked up about? Is it worth it, right? And what Buddhism is asserting here, I think, and I think it's useful psychologically, and it relates back to this issue of the 8 worldly concerns, is if you think, right, if you think this other person and I are definitely going to be dead and could be dead next week, right, then how would your behavior and attitude change, right? It's not that you don't care, actually, like, or if you actually try it, right, if you try contemplating like that, it's not that you stop caring about anything, but it's that you stop caring about things that are not terribly important in the long run. Does that make sense? Like, in that case, and you have to check for yourself, but this is what many people have observed, including Buddhist teachers who have contemplated like this, is if you meditate like that, right? If you recognize, I'm going to die, everybody else is going to die, all these places won't exist, then, fighting over, like, what's I going to say it? Fighting over who did the laundry, or fighting over, like, are they asking you to do a little more work or a little less work, or, like, just don't seem that important, actually. But certain things do seem important, right? And what does still seem important, it seems, if you check, for example, was I loving? Or is that still useful, right? Whereas if you know you're gonna die, actually you still care, right? In other words, if you're like, and actually you check that, right? Look back over people you know who died, right? And then, like, if you think, wow, I argued over that, the person's dead now, who cares? It's like, it seems so silly, right? But actually, if you were loving, or if they were loving to you, that still matters, right? Think of somebody who's dead. Like, it's easy actually, right? If you think of somebody who's dead who is loving to you, the fact that they were loving to you matters, right? All the rest is a little bit silly. Maybe it matters if they taught you something, right? But most of the stuff that you got upset about, or argued about, or like, what's the word, or had like tensions about, are silly from that perspective. And what Buddhism is asserting actually is, actually, well, I'll point out one more thing, actually, which is this, is actually mourning, right? You know the word like mourning, like grief and mourning, right? Actually, like sometimes one way of viewing the grief process or mourning process is this, is, when somebody's dead, right, you have to let go, you have no choice, you have to let go of all the things that your ego got from them, right? Because your ego can't get anything from them anymore, because they're not going to do stuff. They're not going to say, oh, you're so wonderful. They're not going to, tell you that you're whatever, beautiful. They're not going to thank you for, for anything. Also, they're not going to do you any favors, right, when they're dead. So your ego has to give up on all those things, right? They're not going to accompany you when you're feeling lonely. They're not going to, whatever, cook you dinner, right? All those kind of things, right? So your ego has to let go of all the things that it relied on that person for, or wanted from that person, right? So if you succeed in mourning and you let go of all that because they're gone, you have no choice, then what's left, right? You don't forget the person. So 2 things are left. One is your memory, the other is your love, right? Those are the 2 things that are left of the person. So one way this is just my own way of describing it, I say sometimes when I think about this teaching of Buddhism, I say, I think what it's saying is, mourn me now. Like, there is like it's saying, mourn people now, let go of the ego part and just stay with your memories and your love. Don't wait till they're dead to mourn them, in other words, to let your ego let go of all the things it wants from them. Does that kind of make sense, what I'm getting at there? That's just my own way of describing it. It's not Buddhist, it's not a Buddhist text that says that. And so really I think that this idea of meditating on impermanence is a way of like being more peaceful, being more at ease, not getting so upset when things change. But it's also like a pathway to love, actually, without agendas. Does that make sense? When you're caught up in the idea of permanence, your love always has some kind of agenda to it. Does that make sense, right? Like, because you feel like I'm going to be around for a long time and I want this person to do this and I want to do that, and they're going to be around, so I want that from them. But if you recognize they could die tomorrow, then it's easier to let go of the agenda, but actually you don't let go of the love part, because that stays even after they're dead. Does that kind of make sense? So I just want to talk about that a little bit with the impermanence thing. I'm trying to decide if we have... Since we've meditated on impermanence, like, are there any questions about that? Because what I might do is go on to the next thing and not meditate on impermanence right now. But I'll say one last thing, because it answers your question you asked last time. So I wanted to say that too. And then we'll go on to the next thing. unless people have questions. But the one other thing I wanted to say is this, is in terms of this idea of meditating on death and impermanence, the other thing is many Buddhist teachers say this, that actually, Milarepa, he was like the most famous Tibetan yogi. And there was a quote from him that I always liked. He said, being afraid of death, I went to the mountains to meditate, but now I've achieved freedom from all fears. And the idea here is this, sometimes, I guess what I'm getting at is this, is when we're caught in the idea of permanence, then naturally we fear death, right? Like death is the ultimate insult to our ego, actually, right? If you're identified with narcissism, actually, right, with the sense of I exist and I'm important, to the extent, any moment where we're identified with death is the ultimate enemy, right? It's the ultimate insult because what death is saying is no, you're not, right? Like in other words, everything I hold on to and think is important, death is saying, good luck with that, right? Like it's not going to happen. And we're all like that. In other words, all normal people are like that. And what Buddhism is asserting is this, is if we face death now, while we're alive, if we contemplate it, and then we live in the face of that, right? Which means living a life grounded in love, grounded in wisdom, grounded in compassion, then actually what all Buddhist teachers say, and you check for yourself if you your own experience, but what they say is this, is if you do that, right, if you face death day by day, and then you live a life grounded in those qualities, in compassion and love and wisdom, then you live a good, heartfelt life, and actually then they say then death becomes less and less frightening, actually. And they talk about like that then, some people talk about like having a good life and a good death, right? Like in other words, that if you live that kind of good life, that version of a good life, right, then Lama Zopa often points this out. He says people who live that way, he said that when they die, they're content, actually. Whereas then they're not afraid, because because there's a sense of satisfaction, right? And also there's not this identification with permanence. Whereas they've lived with a sense of acceptance and going with the flow and understanding how things actually are. And so then death is not the ultimate insult, it's a transition. It may be a little scary, but it's not. There's a difference between death being the ultimate insult and death being a transition. Does that kind of make sense? So I think those are two different views, depending on how the person lives and how they view life. So, anyway. Any questions, though? Because I want to then go on to another point that we'll do our exercise. We'll do an exercise.
So is permanence then the ultimate donut hole?
That's a good question.
Is this the most difficult to deal with? It's the most compelling?
It's one of the most difficult and compelling. There's actually, according to Buddhism, there's one that's even more difficult and compelling, which is the idea of the feeling and idea that I exist inherently from my own side, or that I truly exist. That's actually even a harder one.
Oh, okay.
So there's one that's harder, at least. But permanence is up there.
Sounds pretty hard.
Yeah. They say, I think permanence is number 2, though.
Very good. Thank you.
Is that the difference between self-grasping and self-cherishing?
No. Self-grasping is that idea of I truly exist. That's self-grasping. But self-cherishing is not permanent. That's not the idea of permanence. Self-cherishing is the idea. It's a set of ideas, actually, but it's that's what I'm translating as narcissism. So the idea of permanence is part of that. But self-cherishing also includes this idea of, includes a feeling I'm important, that my happiness is more important than it's not an idea, it's a feeling, actually. The feeling that my happiness is more important than your happiness, that my well-being is more happy than your well-being, that my being healthy is more happy. It's like this. When I hear, oh, so-and-so has the flu, I say, oh, that's a shame. But then I think, oh no, I'm getting the flu. That's self-cherishing. So I mean, like, this feeling of like that my getting the flu is terribly important and other people's getting the flu is, oh, that's a shame. Or like my being happy is really important and other people's being happy is, oh, that's great. Oh, how nice, you're happy, that's really good. I'm glad you have good news. And then you focus back on, what I mean? So that self-cherishing is a kind of self-focus, and also a kind of sense of importance, of self-importance. Is what it's saying.
And that's all rooted in self-grasping.
Yeah, self-grasping has to come first, and then self-cherishing comes after. But actually, it's an important point in Buddhism that you can destroy, though, if you don't cultivate bodhicitta, you can destroy self-grasping without destroying self-cherishing, just because it's a habit. So if you don't actively get rid of self-cherishing, even if you succeed in destroying self-grasping, the self-cherishing doesn't end on its own accord, because it's been a long habituation to feeling self-important. So you have to act, if you want to get rid of self-cherishing, you actually have to actively work at getting rid of it, through cultivating bodhicitta and things like that.
And then emptiness and stuff too, right? It's part of the whole.
Yeah, they help each other. We have to do both to get rid of self. Because arhats, for example, have fully realized emptiness, but they still have a residual self-cherishing from past lives, or from their old habit. So you have to actively, to get rid of the self. So emptiness is a very powerful antidote to self-grasping, but in and of itself, it's not sufficient. You have to actively get rid of it too. Does that make sense? Kind of, because otherwise you could become like achieve your own nirvana, for example, but not work for the welfare of others because of the habit of self-cherishing. Okay, so what I wanted to spend a little bit of time on now is this: there's actually okay, maybe I'll start with a story actually about this point. Like many years ago, I was in Nepal at Kopan Monastery, and Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who's the co-founder of that monastery and the spiritual director of the center, he was teaching there, but he had asked all these different lamas there to come out, like he was like bugging them in a way, to come out and tell their biographies, and also some of the old Western monks and nuns, like tell their life story. And so Tibetans often don't want to do that, but he was, if Lama Zopa asked, they had no choice, right? So many were coming out and telling their life stories, and then he asked Geshe Lama Kuncho, if anybody's seen the movie, what's it called, The Unmistaken Child, that movie's about his reincarnation. So he was this great yogi, really amazing yogi, and Lama Zopa asked him to tell his life story. And Geshe Lama Kuncho, I don't think, wanted to. Lama Zopa asked again, and nobody turns down Lama Zopa at Kopan. So he agreed to do it. But then he came in, I can't remember his exact words, but he basically came in, he sat down, he said something like, Zopa Rinpoche asked me to say something about my life. I don't know, something like that. He was kind of, and then he said something like, and then he said, I once heard a teaching that said, prefer blame to praise. Prefer being blamed to being praised. And he said, and then he said something, and prefer losing things to getting things. And prefer bad reputation to a good reputation. And prefer like a sort of discomfort to comfort. And then he said, I can't remember all his words, but he basically said something like, he said, when I was off meditating under a tree one time, the people in the village thought I was a demon because I was so skinny and had such long hair, it looked so weird to them, that they threw rocks at me, and I had to leave. And he said, that was wonderful. He said, I was so happy. He said, I can't tell you how happy I was. They said, now I'm here at this Kopan, and you Americans come and you offer me Coca-Cola. It's terrible. And he said something like, and he said maybe said a few more things, and they said, that's my biography, any questions? And of course he hadn't said a word about it. He mentioned being under a tree, that's about it. He hadn't mentioned anything about his life. And it was funny, and then somebody said to him, I think probably an American, raised their hand and said, yeah, I have a question. That was a fascinating story you told, but I'm going back to America, and how do I practice something like that there? And he said, practice it or don't, but there's no other thing, there's no special dispensation for Americans or something. So practice it or don't practice it, it's up to you, or something like that. And then he's like that. He was kind of a no-nonsense person. But so he never did tell any more biography on it. But what I want to explore was that teaching he shared. The teaching of, because we were talking about the 8 worldly concerns, right? So the 8 worldly concerns are the exact opposite of what he was describing, right? Ordinary people prefer being praised, right? We like hearing sweet things. Oh, you're so nice, you're wonderful. And we really hate it when somebody says, you're an idiot, you're a jerk, that we really don't like that. And we really like being comfortable. We don't like being uncomfortable. We like getting a raise, and we don't like getting demoted, right? Nobody likes it when they go into work and their boss says, we've just decided we're going to cut your salary and change your position to a less prestigious salary. Right? Whereas even if they say you'll get a more prestigious title, we're happy, right? And then if they also give us more money, then we're happy. You know, like, right? So that's ordinary people. So he was saying, his practice was to be the opposite of that, right? And actually, there are many teachings like that. There's one. There are these verses from the from old lamas who would say things like that. They would say, you know, verses that got at that same point. So, actually, I'll quote one. This one guy said, he said something like, "May I achieve the rank of a dog." That was his version of that. This one verse. Right? And so I thought it was interesting. The reason why I think that's interesting, first of all, is this: is in terms of bringing up the feeling. This gets to your question, right? Bringing up the visceral feeling. One easy way to bring up those visceral feelings is that, right? In other words, like, you know, if you achieve the rank of a dog, that'll bring up the visceral feeling for sure, right? Because if somebody treats you like a dog, is what he's getting at, right? Whereas if somebody, you know, if bad things happen, that, in other words, we don't have to make effort then to bring up the visceral feeling. It comes up quite naturally, right? You know, if somebody comes up to you and starts insulting you, actually, you don't have to try to bring up a visceral feeling of your eye or your, you know, it'll happen all by itself, in a way, you know, quite effectively. And what Buddhism, but I want to say now what I think Buddhism is getting at with this, actually, because in other words, so it's just that bad experience is not the goal, right? In other words, like if you said, oh, so I'm going to go be a masochist, that's not what it's talking about, actually. That's not this teaching at all. What this teaching is saying is this, is if you want to actually do, it's getting at your exact question, right? In other words, how do you really contemplate, you know, and sort of bring these things up in an interesting way so that you can really get at something interesting, right? To actually contemplate what's going on. Am I attached to praise, right? In other words, we can all say, you know, like, I mean, what was it? My mom, when I was a kid, said, you know, sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never hurt you, or something like that, right? Which is, you know, if you're attached to praise, it's not true, right? Then words hurt you a lot. If you don't care about praise, then it doesn't. Then it is true, you know, so it depends. But the point here is this, is if you want to, it's actually, I wrote down a phrase I wanted to use today. To me, this is Dharma play, actually. That idea that Geshe Lama Kunchok was getting at is actually somebody who's really into Dharma, right, really into practicing Dharma, and who wants to play at Dharma, like really engage. I mean, and what I mean play, what I mean by that is like, you know, somebody who loves a sport is going to really play at that sport, right? You're going to really engage in it and play, but in a creative way. It's not like so serious either. You know what I mean? That's why I'm using the word play. In other words, I'm not talking about play like, actually when kids play also, right? Like when kids play, I mean really play, you know, they're both serious and playful at the same time, right? They're enjoying what they're doing, but they're also being serious. It's also serious to them. Whereas it's not like they're really engaged. If you're really playing, you're really engaged in what you're doing. And actually that's how you learn, right? Kids learn by playing, you know. And so the idea here is that I think that this kind of training is a way of playing with, like engaging in that kind of play. Does that make sense? Where you're really engaging and sort of learning something, but you're doing it in a creative way. Does that make sense, kind of? So the idea here would be this, you know, we've been talking for a few classes now about this issue of the 8 worldly concerns and, you know, like, you know, wanting praise, wanting comfort, wanting, and so on. And so it's one thing to contemplate them, but what this is actually a behavioral approach, right? So it's what Geshe Lama Kunchok was getting at, and other teachers were getting at, is this, is if you really want to experiment, maybe that's another word you can use, experiment with the Dharma, then what you can do is, and this gets at your question, right, how do you make it visceral, is you intentionally choose a situation, right, and you, what's this is, like for example, you take a situation where you'd ordinarily want to win, and you decide to lose. But you do it not for the sake of losing, you do it to watch your own reactions and work with them. Does that make sense? So you're doing it as a way of, like, you know, because if you just say, I'm going to imagine losing, I'm going to sit here and meditate, that's not that visceral, actually, right? But if you go out in the world and you say, okay, I'm going to intentionally, like there's a verse in the 7-point mind training that says, I'll take the loss and give the victory to somebody else, right? So for example, what does that mean, right? I'll take an example of what that means. That means with your friend or your spouse or somebody or your parent, right? Everybody has this. If you live with somebody or you're close with people, there are habitual arguments, right? There are certain things that like you get in disagreements about, right? If you have kids, if you have parents, if you have anybody you know, spend enough time with, then there are habitual disagreements, right? And actually, oftentimes you could actually script it, right? You could say, I'll say this, they'll say that, and I'll say this, then they'll say that, and then it'll end with one of 2 or 3 ways, right? You can predict, actually. And the idea here would be, if you want to practice this training, right, is you say, okay, next time that comes up, or I'll bring that up, I'm gonna do it totally differently, so that the other person actually feels like they won the argument and I lost. Right? That's all it is. It's not. There's like, and then I'm going to notice how I feel, right? And if there's some feeling that comes up of like, oh, I wanted to win, I'll meditate on that actually, because that's interesting, right? In other words, because where does that come from? In other words, that's craving, right? Craving for some kind of win. That who cares, right? I've had this argument 20 or 30,000 times, and it's stupid, right? So you actually, this is a way of actually changing. Does that make sense? It's like a way of really more powerfully changing your life. So does that make sense? Take that example, right? I'm sure everybody here has somebody who they've had an argument with repeatedly over and over, or disagreement, right? And like, so you think, I have some attachment, right? Some craving to win that argument, right? But first of all, I'm never going to win it, because I've had it 1,000 times, right? And secondly, even if I do win it, I don't win, right? Whereas if it's somebody you're close with, like the examples I gave, right? Your spouse, your child, even if I win, they're going to feel bad, and then eventually they're going to get even, right? Or something. Or they're going to try to take it out, or they're going to try again, or whatever. Like, it doesn't work, actually, right? In other words, if I beat the person who I supposedly love, how does that win? Do I really win then? No, right? And so this kind of training would be to say, okay, I'm going to really try to make them actually feel like they won, right? That doesn't mean like, I let you on, ha ha ha. That's not this, right? Say, yeah, you're right, and then roll your eyes. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about here is like to actually try that, right? And then the idea would be, this is the important part, right? The idea would be if you go in there, right, and you let's say you evoke that, right? Let's say it's about a particular thing, and you do that thing, and then they say what they say, and then you say, you've been pointing that out for a long time, and you're right. I've been wrong all these years, and I'm so sorry. I'm going to change as of now. Right? And they look at you like, what the hell are you talking about? And then they think you're maybe joking, and you say, no, I just realized I'm wrong.
So is it from like a fear?
That's what arises, right?
Yeah.
Some fears, or maybe, oftentimes it's fear that
So if
arises.
you say like, I'm scared, then, can the fear go away?
Well, the idea would be this, though. Then you meditate on it, right? In other words, that's the key, though. Is that then, in other words, it's not just to. In other words, if all you did was say you're right and I'm wrong, then you're going to resent them, right? And then you're going to wait, and then later you're going to say, do it in some way where it makes them look like they're wrong. And then you say, well, I agreed with you, but look, you turned out you were wrong all along. That's not. Again, that wouldn't work, right? What you're getting is right. In other words, then you have to actually meditate. In other words, so you look at it and you see like, does it matter, right? Like, in other words, if we're both going to be dead in 100 years, does it matter, right? There are many reasonings that you can use, right? If this person died tomorrow, would it matter? Also, even if I win, does it matter? Is it worth winning that argument? Also, let's say this. Is there some kind of a egoistic pride going on? Or is there some fear of like losing my ground, or of not having the power, or of not, it's like, you have to actually analyze it for yourself and say, I don't want to live like that, right? In other words, you have to come to your own insight of, I don't want to live with this in my heart. It's not about the other person in this case. It's about your own process, you see. And actually, you're giving the victory to them because it benefits you. That's really the point. In other words, it benefits both of you because they're interrelational. But you have to actually meditate on it until you overcome whatever fear or discomfort or, but the discomfort should arise. Sometimes when people start this, they think, oh, I should do it, it won't be uncomfortable. That's not the point. The point is, it should be uncomfortable, but that discomfort is your own ego, actually, right? There is that discomfort is coming from your own ego, and this is the way to work with it. And so you're actually experimenting. And you're using relationships as a way of bringing up those feelings in order to meditate on them. At least does the idea make sense, what I'm getting at? I mean, it's a little bit of a hard concept, maybe. Because the key is like to actually, there's two things, right? One is that it has to be something that, you have to realize that you're not doing it only for the other person, you're also doing it to grow. Does that make sense? Otherwise, it doesn't really work, right? Otherwise, you just feel, you may do it, but it's not really, you're not going to be happy. If you actually feel that you're growing in the process, then you actually get happiness from this.
And it would be easier to try it first if the stakes are not very high.
Yeah.
Like not like it's the end of your relationship, but like maybe with a stranger in a coffee shop.
Yeah.
That would be an easier one to play with first.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. You have to start small and build up. And only do, and that's why I think play is a good word. That's why I use that word. Is that, if you start with things, because like when you're playing, right? It's different. Like playing at a playing in a sport is different than fighting with swords, you know, where you could die. Right? Or it's like, you know, then there's a real fear, like, you know, but
Or
you want to start with
playing
things that are
in a
like,
pickup game is different from playing in the NFL.
yeah, right, exactly, yeah, you get it.
Yeah.
And so what we want to do is start with things that are small, where where it will bring up enough so that it'll bring up a feeling, right, that you can work with, but not so big that you're going to freak out if it doesn't go well. And what the idea would be was that if you start that way and you actually start doing it, it'll get easier to do bigger ones over time. Does that make sense? Whereas things that now seem like, oh my goodness, I couldn't possibly handle that. If you start getting happiness from it, that's the key. In other words, if you do this with small things, you go, wow, I feel freer. Well, then it becomes easier. In other words, if you start getting happier and more free, then it's easier to take a chance on something a little bit bigger. Yeah.
I think I'm understanding the concept here. I mean, basically, you're opening yourself up for an opportunity to dissolve the ego, or work on towards dissolving the ego. But I'm just wondering, like let's say your son or daughter comes home and, you know, I don't know, they start smoking crack or something, and then, you know, you're like, hey, why are you smoking crack? They're like, I want to smoke crack, that's my business. Okay, I don't think necessarily this is a kind of time to practice dissolving the ego, right?
No, but to me, like, let me give an example on that one,
So just to clarify, like,
No, of
this
course
is
not.
an experiment that we should use judiciously, I assume, and not ignore, for example, like, practicing safety for as being a parent or someone else, like,
Right.
when the safety of another is concerned.
No, but actually, I agree 100% with you. Let me just elaborate even one further step. Because, like, actually in that case, right, with the, like, crack's an extreme example, but let's say there are people, I'm going to give a counter example, because I give the example of losing the argument, right? But then there are some people who are, like, always afraid, who have an ego pattern of always being afraid of speaking their mind or saying the truth, or if they think the other person's going to be upset with them, right? That's actually an attachment to praise. Like, in other words, I don't want to hear criticism, so I'm not going to say something even though I'm not going to tell somebody an unpleasant truth, or I'm not going to set a boundary with somebody when they're doing something negative, because I don't want to get, because I know if I say, look, I'm not going to let you treat me that way, it's not okay, then the person is going to get angry at me, right? Or they're going to give me negative feedback. They're going to say, I don't want to hear that. Why not? You know, you used to let me do it. What's the big deal? You know, and like, so that could be another example of the exact same thing. In other words, it's the opposite behavior, but again, it's challenging your own ego, right? Whereas my ego says, oh, don't conflict because they're not going to like me, right? And to say, well, no, then I'll conflict. In other words, I'm going to go in there, I'm going to say what they don't want to hear, and let them, you know, say, I don't like hearing that, and I don't like that you're changing, why are you being that? But to say, you know what, good. Like, then I'll take the criticism because I'm doing something that's true. You know, in other words, if you recognize what I'm saying is the truth, I have the right to say it, and I'll take the criticism, but I'm not going to back down. That would be another example of this, actually. You see what I mean? Like, so it's not always losing the argument. Sometimes it's being willing to win an argument for some people. Or to set a boundary with somebody, even though, right? Because like with that example, right? If you say with the child who's acting out, I'm going to set a boundary and they're going to scream and yell and have a tantrum or whatever. But to be willing to take that, right? Like if the person, I'm only giving the example, if the person were, let's say, averse to that often, would sort of sweep it under the rug, right? And then to say, no, I'm not going to sweep it under the rug. That would be another example of this kind of, the same, in other words, it would be, to me, that would be just as good an example of working with your ego, right? But in that case, it's overcoming the fear of somebody criticizing you for standing up for your beliefs or whatever.
But you have to do that with the mindset of not being controlling at the same
Right.
time, right?
Yeah, the idea is, and the idea is like, internally what you would be thinking is, I have this pattern, you know, I'm not trying, I have this pattern of avoiding, my goal right now is not to avoid, you know, in that example, right? So I'm going to face something difficult, and I'm going to be truthful, even if it could bring some interpersonal tension for a while. And that the goal is not to control the other person, it's actually to free myself from a habit of not saying the truth, let's say, or not, you know, or avoiding certain difficult truths because it's uncomfortable. And I want to be more brave than that, I want to be more real than that. So that would be, you know, in other words, the behavior would look the opposite, but the goal is the same, right? It's to overcome a pattern that's based on the 8 worldly concerns, right? And that one is the basis is I don't want criticism, right? And a lot of people have that one, right? So that would be one to overcome, is like, I don't like people criticizing me, so I'm not going to say anything controversial, even if it's true, right? A lot of people do that. That's another ego-based fear, and this will be a way of overcoming. And the reason why I wanted to emphasize this last training, this idea or this way of training for today, is honestly a lot of these ones, if you just contemplate it at home, it's not very effective. Whereas if you think, yeah, I don't care about what anybody says about me, and I believe in the truth, right? Well, if you're not willing to go say something to somebody and have them get annoyed with you, that's not very meaningful, really. You know, it's like, it's nice that you thought it, it's okay, but it's not really very powerful, right? Whereas if you go out and you do that, right, you say, okay, I'm going to tell this person something and they're going to get annoyed with me. And I'll say something like that. You know, like people where I've avoided, right? And I'll take the criticism, but I'll say, well, that's what I believe. You know, I believe it's true, right? And let them, you know, think what they think of me, and I'll be nice to them anyway, and hopefully the relationship will be better in the long run. My point is like, that's real. I mean, that's much more, what's the way to say it? It's much more transformative than only if you're sitting on your meditation cushion saying, I don't care what anybody, you know, I'm free from all attachment to reputation or something. Does that make sense? That's why I think it's more, I think this is more interesting. And that's why I call it play again. It's like, it's interesting, it's dynamic if you do that. Did you comment? Oh, I thought you were. And again, I'll just give another example because I don't want it to seem like it's always. I think your question is great because I don't want it to seem like I just picked the example of losing an argument that's a habit, right? But it could be standing up, or it could be also like comfort, right? Like let's say you have a habit, right? You say, okay, I have a habit of like doing this certain thing for comfort, right? Like, and I know it's not the healthiest thing to do, or not the best habit, or not the most, you know, and whether that's some interpersonal thing, or what I do, you know, a certain time of day, or how I relate to food, whatever it would be, right, that you have this habit with, it's to say, this, and it would be the same thing, right, to say, well, if I stop doing that, I'm going to feel uncomfortable, actually, right, because that's what's my comfort, you know, but and again, if it's a healthy comfort, good, do it, you know, if you say, you know, if your comfort is that you have a bad back, and so you're going to sleep on a comfortable bed, keep doing that, that's a good idea. That's not, you know, because it's like what we were getting at earlier, it's not to be unrealistic here, but it's something where you recognize, oh, there's something unhealthy in how I'm relating to comfort. You see what I'm getting at? You recognize that there's like a grasping attachment, not a healthy relationship there. And so then in this one, you wouldn't just say, you know, you'd have to meditate first. Okay, how's that how's that unhealthy? How does that? You would do the meditation, but then you would say, okay, I'm going to break that habit. I'm not going to do that for 1 week, no matter what. I'm not going to do that thing. And let's see what happens, right? And then you would watch the feeling of discomfort arise, and you would say, good, that's what I was hoping for, right? You don't think, oh, like. Whereas first the feeling of physical discomfort might arise, you know, whatever, oh, I'm not having my, whatever the pattern would be, right? But then a feeling of emotional discomfort would arise too. Oh, I want that. Why did I make this commitment? Why did I say a whole week? I meant like 2 days. Why did I say a week? I didn't mean that. You know, but actually that's the good thing, right? That's when it's coming up, and that's where you meditate, you know? So it's not that that's a self-torment, and you have to decide for, again, I'm just giving an example of a week. You decide for yourself, but you see what I'm getting at there. The idea in this kind of training is you do something to bring up the feeling in order to work with it in meditation. Does that make sense? And I'm just trying to give a variety of ideas so that you don't just think it's some one, or it could be anything, right?
The observation of that feeling makes the transformation.
It's two things though. First, yeah, exactly. First, you have to observe the feeling. But then the next step is you actually contemplate. And really, if you contemplate well, it's a fascinating process actually that happens. Because here's what happens. Like, let's take the example of discomfort, right? So let's say you say, okay, I always do this thing every day at whatever, at night, you know, to make myself feel comfortable. I watch a certain show, or I eat a certain thing, or whatever, right? And then you don't do that. And then the feeling of discomfort, like, oh, I really want to do that. I wish I hadn't made this commitment to myself, right? Arises. So the first step is you notice it, right? You be aware of it. But actually then, what you actually, like, then actually if you contemplate, and that's what becomes even more powerful. Because what you actually contemplate is this, is you say, wow, that feeling is, whether you want to call it this, that's grieving my own ego, like what I gave earlier. That's the grief, actually, right? In other words, you have to feel it. You don't grieve somebody by saying, oh, well, no big deal, right? Whereas if we're going to grieve our own ego, that's the feeling. And again, not that you don't want to do something overwhelming, but if you can handle it, right, whatever level you can. And then you think, actually, you contemplate like this. I'll give some examples. Wow, if I stay in that pattern, actually, it seems comfortable now, but then, actually, first of all, I don't feel good about myself. Secondly, it's wasting my life, actually. It's not something meaningful. In other words, if it's something that, again, you have to choose the right one. If it's the good habit, then don't break it.
Let me give you an example. I'm sitting on the floor. Normally I don't.
Yeah.
And my knees are really hurting.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point in time, I'm just observing it, that particular pain.
Mm-hmm.
What is contemplation?
So contemplation would be this, see, in that one, first you have to check, is it good or is it bad? Like, in other words, to me, that's not clear yet if it's a healthy or unhealthy. Like, I'll give an example. Like, you might say, it's a change of a pattern, right? And so you might say, so actually, well, the first thing is this, is you might ask yourself, is there a reasonable chance you're going to permanently injure your knees? Probably not, right? So then you can say, Okay, like, so this is actually an example in Buddhism, actually, you would contemplate, right? You would say, okay, so my knees hurt, right? So the contemplation would be like this, would be, actually, if my intention in coming today, right, if my intention in doing this was to gain some wisdom, right? And then to bear a little bit, it's not unbearable, but a little bit of pain on the path to trying to gain some wisdom, well, actually, that's good, you know? Many people generate so much pain, actually, for such stupid things, you know, like to make a little more money, or to, like, kill an animal, right? People go through so much, like, pain just to hunt, right? To kill something. Or people go through so much pain, like, just to get rid of their enemy, to get even with their enemy. I'm bearing some pain for wisdom, actually, for my own effort to practice more compassion. Actually, how wonderful that is, right? If more people in the world would do that, it'd be a better planet, actually. You know, like,
Is
it's
the
great.
relative part important in terms of others not doing the right thing, or?
I'm just giving examples.
Okay.
No, I'm just giving examples of ways of, it doesn't have to be in relation to others. But actually, so what you do is you keep contemplating, and you say it actually, like, I'll give it, I mean, again, I'll give a traditional Buddhist example, actually. Like, the Buddha, actually, in many of the life stories of the Buddha, his previous lives to become a Buddha, he bore, like, so many, he told in his life many stories of his past lives where he went through all kinds of, like, difficulties to contemplate and to meditate and to, you know, and that was part of his process of becoming a Buddha, was sort of bearing the discomfort on the path in order to gain wisdom. And what the Buddha said was there is always some discomfort on the path to gain wisdom. You know, for everybody. In other words, whether it's in your knees or in your back or also in your mind. And, you know, there are many levels of discomfort, but actually the path to wisdom always includes some discomfort. And so if I'm bearing some discomfort, good. Actually, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. I should, you know. And the goal is that you keep contemplating until you feel the pain in the knees doesn't go away, but the pain in your mind goes away, and you start to feel,
So contemplating
I'm okay with
discomfort
this.
as change management rather than anything else.
Yeah, until you feel at peace mentally. In other words, so the physical feeling may still be there, but your mind actually starts to feel happy. And I remember there's a quote like Lama Zopa said, if you get good at this kind of contemplation, he said, then when problems arise, some external problem, it's not like a pain in your knee or somebody criticizing you, whatever it would be, right? He said, you know, the problem is still there, and you may feel some initial discomfort, but then this feeling arises in your mind. He said that it's like ice cream, is the analogy he gave. In other words, your mind feels totally happy and content, even though the external thing is happening that you maybe at first wouldn't have wanted. And he said that's a measure, he was getting at, that's a measure of succeeding in training your mind, actually, to bear challenges in life in a healthy, in a positive way. Is that?
Yeah.
So what I wanted to do now is this. We always do this little exercise of breaking up into groups. And so what I wanted to ask people to do is
Real quick
oh yeah.
question, just real short, but it seems to me that this is all about self-improvement and playing these games with ourselves.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that it helps the other person.
Oh, usually.
Maybe just as much. Because when I've had ego clashes with other people, and I had them do that, and they have somehow suppressed their ego or let me win. It's a shallow victory.
Right.
It really makes me contemplate, wow. You know, so it seems like this doesn't have to be self thing. It's
No, right.
doing it for everyone.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Including yourself.
I agree 100%. Yes, you're right. You're 100% right. Yeah, and actually, like, and also, like, what's sort of say this, that if you think about this method, actually, really, this kind of method, it would be, this is, like, the Dalai Lama often says, outer disarmament, outer peace. Peace in the world requires inner disarmament. That's what he said. Whereas, like, for there not to be wars externally means people have to inside, because nations are just people, right? And so he says people have to disarm themselves, and then there won't be so much conflict in the world. And what he's talking about is this, right? In other words, is being willing to change. Being willing to say something that's true even if it's unpleasant. Being willing to lose an argument when that's what's needed. Being willing to be flexible and peaceful, right? And not, and so actually us doing this is, this is what when he says people have to become peaceful within for the world to be more peaceful, he's talking about people doing this, actually, right? This is not something else. It's learning to tolerate and be patient and be flexible. And that is the way to change the world, actually. There is no other way to change the world. It's part of the point. Right? If we wait for somebody else to change, always, then it doesn't work. But so what I wanted to suggest is, okay, so break up into groups of 3 or so, and for 15 minutes is this. It's just to try to think, here's my suggestion, is to try, as you said, don't reach too high, but don't reach too low. Like, reach high enough so that it bring up a feeling, but not so high that you're going to freak out or be terribly upset. And to just share in a group, like to talk to each other And each person individually try to come up with one thing that you're willing to try like this. Does that make sense? This week. So pick, and again, not something huge, doesn't have to be earth-shattering, but something with a real person in your life at work or at home or on the phone or wherever, on the internet, wherever you interact, or some situation also, like you were saying. It doesn't have to be a person; it can also be a situation, right? Like, but that you're willing to do something that you know that you're likely to have some kind of reaction to, that you'll then use that reaction as a process of contemplation and growth. You get it, right? Okay, so go ahead and just break them into small groups and just to me it's useful to talk to each other, to share ideas, and to get ideas from somebody else. And then we'll say 5 minutes at the end. You don't have to all share your idea, it can be private, but we'll come back and just if anybody has questions or comments.